worthless old woman. Those were the exact words my own daughter said about me, right there at our Thanksgiving table, in front of everyone. She didn't lower her voice, didn't show any shame. And me? I just smiled, looked at her, finished chewing my piece of turkey slowly and said nothing. In that moment, it wasn't worth the fight. But the next morning, with the November sun barely creeping through my kitchen windows, I got up, grabbed my purse, called a locksmith, and changed every single lock in this house. Front door, back door, even the garden gate. All without warning, without yelling, without making a scene. In that silence, I knew it wasn't me who was on the outside of this family anymore. It was them. My name is Dorothy Mae Henderson, and I'm 72 years old. Born and raised right here in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Back then, this town was nothing but endless cornfields, stretching toward the horizon, and one main street lined with dreams that seemed bigger than the whole world. The smell of fresh earth after spring rain still takes me back to those days when everything felt possible. My father worked at the John Deere factory, coming home each night with grease under his fingernails and stories of the machines he helped build. My mother tended our vegetable garden and made the most incredible apple butter you've ever tasted, stirring it in that old copper pot while humming hymns under her breath. I started working young too, waiting tables at Murphy's Diner after school, learning to balance plates and listen to people's troubles at the same time. The smell of bacon grease and coffee still makes my heart skip a beat, remembering Mrs. Murphy teaching me that listening was just as important as serving. Those were the days when a quarter tip felt like a fortune, and every customer had a story worth hearing. I saved every penny in a mason jar hidden under my bed, dreaming of something more than this small town could offer. But life has a way of showing you that sometimes the something more was right there all along, waiting for you to notice it. I ended up spending 35 years as a school secretary at Cedar Falls Elementary, watching thousands of children grow from scared kindergartners to confident fifth graders ready to take on the world. My desk was always stocked with Band-Aids for scraped knees and peppermints for upset stomachs, because I learned early that healing often starts with something small and sweet. I knew every child's name, every parent's worry, every teacher's struggle to make ends meet on a salary that barely covered the basics. My hands filed countless report cards, signed hundreds of permission slips, and wiped away more tears than I could ever count. Those children became my purpose in ways I never expected, filling something inside me that I didn't even know was empty. I watched them learn to read, saw their faces light up when math finally made sense, celebrated their small victories like they were my own grandchildren. Their mothers would stop by my desk to share their concerns, their hopes, their fears about raising good kids in a world that seemed to be changing too fast. I became the keeper of secrets, the holder of dreams, the one who remembered birthdays when everyone else forgot. When budget cuts came and computers replaced the need for someone like me, I cleaned out my desk with the same quiet dignity I'd brought to that job for 3 decades. I took home a box full of thank you cards from students, photos from school plays, and little gifts that meant the world to me. As I walked out of those familiar hallways for the last time, I carried with me the knowledge that I had mattered, that my life had touched others in ways that would ripple forward long after I was gone. That job taught me something precious about worth. It's not measured in paychecks or titles, but in the quiet moments when you make someone else's day a little brighter. Every scraped knee I bandaged, every anxious parent I comforted, every child I helped feel seen and valued. That was my legacy, and no one, not even my own daughter, could take that away from me. I married my Robert when I was 23. Fresh-faced and full of hope, wearing my grandmother's pearl necklace and a dress I'd sewn myself from ivory satin that cost more than I wanted to spend, but less than my dreams deserved. He was the most gentle man I'd ever known, with calloused hands from working construction, and eyes that crinkled when he laughed at my terrible attempts at cooking in our first tiny apartment. Our wedding was simple, just family, and a few close friends gathered in the little Methodist church where I'd been baptized, with wildflowers from my mother's garden decorating the altar. Robert built us a life with the same steady patience he brought to every house he framed, every foundation he poured. He'd come home dusty and tired, but always with a story about something funny that happened on the job, or a compliment he'd overheard about his work. Saturday mornings we'd sit on our front porch with coffee and the newspaper, planning our garden or dreaming about the children we hoped to have someday. He had this way of making even the ordinary moments feel precious, like we were living inside a prayer answered. When the babies came, first Michael, then Sarah 2 years later, and finally, our surprise blessing Tommy when we thought we were done. Robert transformed into the father I'd always hoped he'd be. He built cradles with his own hands, carved wooden toys during the long winter evenings, and read bedtime stories in voices that made our children giggle until they fell asleep, smiling. I'd watch him from the kitchen doorway, my heart so full, it felt like it might burst with the simple joy of seeing this good man love our children with his whole being. Those early years were a beautiful chaos of scraped knees and birthday parties, Christmas mornings and summer camping trips to the lake, where the children would spend hours catching minnows in mason jars. I packed countless lunches, sewed Halloween costumes, and stayed up late helping with school projects that somehow always got remembered the night before they were due. My hands were constantly busy, braiding hair, tying shoes, wiping tears, applauding every small achievement as if it were the most remarkable thing in the world. Sarah was my shadow in those days, following me around the kitchen while I cooked, asking endless questions about everything from why onions make you cry to where babies come from. She'd stand on a chair beside me, her little hands covered in flour as we made cookies together, chattering about her friends at school and her dreams of becoming a teacher just like Mrs. Peterson in her second grade class. I treasured those moments, storing them up in my heart like precious photographs, never imagining there would come a day when she'd look at me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. Robert passed 5 years ago come December, slipping away in his sleep after a brief battle with his heart that none of us saw coming. I woke up that morning to find him peaceful beside me, finally free from the chest pains that had been bothering him for months, but that he'd tried to hide from me and the children. The house felt impossibly quiet, without his gentle snoring, without the sound of his coffee cup against the kitchen table, without his voice calling, "Good morning, beautiful," every single day for 46 years. That Thursday morning, I woke before dawn like I always do, the house still wrapped in that soft silence that comes just before the world starts stirring. My bare feet touched the cold hardwood floor, and I pulled my old chenille robe tight around my shoulders, feeling the familiar ache in my joints that reminds me every morning that I'm not the young woman I used to be. The kitchen window showed the first pale light of November, touching the frost on my neighbor's lawn, and I stood there for a moment, breathing in the possibility of what I hoped would be a perfect day. I'd been preparing for this Thanksgiving for weeks, the way I always do, because some traditions are too precious to let slide. My grandmother's china came out of the cabinet, where it sits wrapped in tissue paper 11 months of the year, each piece handled like the treasure it is. Plates with tiny blue roses that match the tablecloth I'd inherited from my mother. The crystal water glasses caught the morning light as I arranged them just so, remembering how my grandmother taught me that setting a beautiful table was a way of saying, "You matter," to the people you love. The turkey had been thawing in my refrigerator for 3 days. A 20-pound bird that would feed an army, but that I'd bought anyway, because I wanted leftovers, wanted the house to smell like home for days afterward. I got up at 5 to slide it into the oven, rubbing butter and sage under the skin the way my mother taught me, my hands working with the muscle memory of decades of holiday mornings, the kitchen filled with that rich, savory scent that means Thanksgiving more than any calendar ever could, and I felt that familiar flutter of excitement mixed with nervous energy that comes with hosting the people you love most. My sweet potato casserole was already assembled in the refrigerator, topped with those little marshmallows that Tommy had loved since he was small enough to sneak them from the bag when he thought I wasn't looking. The green bean casserole, made with fresh beans. Not the frozen kind, because I still believe that love shows up in the details. Waited in my second-best casserole dish, and my famous apple pie, the one that had won the county fair 3 years running, sat cooling on the windowsill, filling the house with the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg and all the warmth of autumn. I set the table with the same care I'd brought to holiday meals for 40 years, folding the napkins just so, arranging the silverware with mathematical precision, placing the little turkey salt and pepper shakers that Robert had surprised me with on our first Thanksgiving as newlyweds. The dining room looked like something from a magazine, but more than that, it looked like love made visible, like all my hopes for family togetherness laid out in porcelain and crystal, and the kind of abundance that comes not from money but from a heart that still believes in the magic of gathering around a table. As I stood in the doorway, surveying my handiwork, I felt that deep satisfaction that comes from creating something beautiful for the people you love. The house was ready, I was ready, and all that remained was for my family to walk through that door and fill these rooms with laughter and stories and the kind of joy that makes all the preparation worthwhile. I had no way of knowing that by evening, everything I thought I knew about my place in this family would be shattered like dropped china. Sarah arrived with David and the twins right at 2 o'clock. As planned, her SUV pulling into my driveway with that familiar crunch of gravel that usually makes my heart leap with anticipation. She looked beautiful, as always, in her burgundy sweater and perfectly styled hair, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing that bright smile she saves for public occasions. The boys tumbled out of the car like puppies, all elbows and energy, and for a moment everything felt exactly as it should. My family coming home to the table I'd prepared, with so much love. Tommy arrived shortly after with Jessica, his girlfriend of 6 months, a sweet girl who always brings me flowers and calls me Mrs. Henderson, with the kind of respect that feels like a gentle balm on my aging heart. Michael called from Seattle to apologize again for missing another holiday. Work, he said. Always work. But his voice came through the speakerphone, warm with regret and love. The house filled with voices and laughter, with the sound of chair legs scraping against hardwood, and the twins arguing over who got to sit next to Grandma. We said grace, the way we always do, hands joined around the table, heads bowed while I offered the same prayer of gratitude I'd been saying for decades. The food was perfect, the turkey carved and steaming, the sides arranged in the serving dishes that only come out for special occasions, everything exactly as it should be. Sarah complimented the meal. David asked for my stuffing recipe again, and the twins ate with the messy enthusiasm of 8-year-olds who'd been promised pie if they cleaned their plates. It was during the second helping, when everyone was relaxed and the wine had loosened tongues, that the conversation turned to technology. Sarah was scrolling through her phone at the table, something that would have horrified my own mother, when she looked up and started talking about some app she'd downloaded to manage her household expenses. I mentioned that I'd been having trouble with my computer, something about the internet being slow, and asked if she could help me figure it out after dinner. That's when her expression changed, when the warm daughter who'd complimented my cooking transformed into someone I barely recognized. She laughed, but not the kind of laugh that includes you, the kind that pushes you away, makes you small. "Oh, Mom," she said, her voice carrying that tone I'd been hearing more and more lately. "You don't understand how any of this works anymore. Everything's digital now. Everything's complicated. You're you're getting to be a worthless old woman who can't keep up with the modern world." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and making my hands tremble around my water glass. The room went silent except for the twins, who kept eating, oblivious to the bomb their mother had just dropped in the middle of our Thanksgiving feast. David stared at his plate. Jessica's eyes widened in shock, and Tommy started to say something before thinking better of it. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing my child's face, someone who could speak such cruelty with a smile still playing at the corners of her mouth. After everyone left, after the dishes were washed and the leftovers packed away in containers I'd probably never see again, I found myself alone in my living room, with the weight of Sarah's words settling into my bones like arthritis pain. The house felt impossibly quiet after hours of laughter and conversation, the silence echoing with the ghost of worthless old woman bouncing off walls that had once sheltered so much love. I sat in Robert's old recliner, the leather worn smooth from years of his presence, and let myself feel the full impact of what had happened at my carefully prepared table. My grandmother's china sat clean and put away, each piece washed with the same reverence I'd shown it for decades. But somehow the ritual felt hollow now. I kept replaying the moment over and over, searching for some sign that I had misunderstood, that maybe Sarah hadn't meant to be as cruel as she'd sounded. But there was no mistaking the dismissive tone, the casual way she'd tossed away my worth like it was nothing more than outdated furniture cluttering up her modern life. I walked through my house in the growing darkness, touching the things that held my history, the family photos on the mantel, the quilts I'd sewn hanging on bedroom walls, the books I'd collected over 7 decades of living and learning. Each item whispered stories of a life fully lived, of a woman who'd mattered to children and parents, and her community, who'd raised 3 babies and loved a good man for nearly 50 years. How had I become worthless in the eyes of the child I'd carried in my body, nursed at my breast, comforted through every childhood heartache? The rocking chair by the window called to me, the same chair where I'd nursed all 3 of my babies, where I'd sat with them through fevers and nightmares, and the small dramas that loom so large in a child's world. I settled into its familiar embrace, feeling the smooth wood that Robert's hands had sanded with such care when we were young and thought we had forever. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows, and I found myself remembering Sarah at 6 years old, curled in my lap in this very chair, begging for one more story before bedtime. My memory brought back that terrible winter when Sarah was small and pneumonia settled in her lungs like a hungry animal. I'd sat in this chair for 3 nights straight, holding her hot little body against my chest, listening to her labored breathing, praying to a God I wasn't sure was listening. I'd sung every lullaby I knew, told every story I could remember, and when those ran out, I made up new ones, just to keep her peaceful in my arms. I'd been her whole world then, the person who could chase away monsters and make everything better with a kiss and a Band-Aid. When the morning sun finally crept through my lace curtains, I was still sitting in that chair, my body stiff from the hours of stillness, but my mind crystal clear about what needed to happen next. Somewhere in the darkness, I'd made a decision that felt as solid as the foundation Robert had laid for this house. If my own daughter could look me in the eye and call me worthless, then maybe it was time to show her exactly what this worthless old woman was capable of. Sleep wouldn't come that night, not with Sarah's words echoing in the hollow spaces of my heart, where a mother's pride used to live. I lay in the bed I'd shared with Robert for 4 decades, staring at the ceiling and listening to the old house settle around me, with creaks and sighs that sounded almost like conversations. The digital clock cast its green glow across the nightstand, marking the slow passage of hours that felt like days, each minute another opportunity to replay the cruelty I'd witnessed at my own Thanksgiving table. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and padded to the kitchen in my bare feet, the cold hardwood a shock that helped clear my head. I put the kettle on for tea, choosing chamomile from the wooden box where I keep my remedies, the same chamomile my mother used to brew when life felt too heavy to bear alone. The familiar ritual of steeping tea in the blue china cup that had been my wedding gift from Robert's aunt steadied my hands and gave my mind something to focus on besides the ache in my chest. Standing at my kitchen window, cradling that warm cup like a prayer, I looked out at the garden Robert and I had planted together Over the years, even in the darkness, I could make out the shapes of the rose bushes he'd surprised me with on our 10th anniversary, the maple tree we'd planted when Michael was born, the little herb garden where I still grow the sage and thyme that flavored tonight's disaster of a meal. This house, this land, this life, all of it was mine, earned through decades of work and love, and the kind of sacrifice that children take for granted, until it's gone. My key ring hung on its little hook by the back door, brass keys catching the moonlight that filtered through my gingham curtains. Those keys represented everything I'd built, everything I'd fought for, everything I'd given my life to create and maintain. The house key, worn smooth from years of turning in the lock. The mailbox key that brought letters from grandchildren and bills I paid with money I'd earned and saved. The garden shed key that protected Robert's tools, still hanging exactly where he'd left them 5 years ago. It struck me like lightning splitting a summer sky. Why was I letting this continue? Why did I keep cooking elaborate meals for people who saw me as nothing more than a convenience? Keep my door open for children who walked through it without gratitude, without respect, without even the basic courtesy they'd show a stranger. This house belonged to me, not because some paper said so, but because I'd earned it with every meal cooked, every floor scrubbed, every tear shed within these walls. As dawn crept across my kitchen windowsill, painting everything in shades of hope and possibility, I made a decision that felt as natural as breathing and as radical as revolution. Today would be different. Today, this worthless old woman would remind everyone exactly what she was worth. I finished my tea, rinsed the cup with the same care I'd shown it for 20 years, and began planning the first day of my new life, a life where Dorothy May Henderson would never again accept being treated as anything less than the queen of her own castle. The hardware store opened at 7, and I was waiting in my car when Pete Miller flipped the sign from closed to open, my hand steady on the steering wheel despite the magnitude of what I was about to do. I'd dressed carefully, my navy blue dress with the pearl buttons, the one that always made me feel capable and dignified, stockings despite the early hour, and the good shoes that pinched my feet but made me stand taller. If I was going to take control of my life, I was going to do it looking like the lady my mother raised me to be. Pete had been selling hardware in this town for 30 years, had helped Robert and me with everything from leaky faucets to the new storm door we'd installed 3 summers ago. He looked surprised to see me so early, coffee still steaming in his hand, and the morning newspaper tucked under his arm. "Dorothy," he said with that easy smile that made everyone feel welcome, "what brings you out so early on this beautiful morning?" I looked him straight in the eye and said with a voice steadier than I felt, "Pete, I need every lock in my house changed, every single one. Today." His eyebrows went up, and I could see the questions forming behind his kind eyes. But Pete Miller had been in business long enough to know when not to pry. "Everything all right?" he asked gently, the way you might speak to a wounded bird. I smoothed my skirt and lifted my chin the way my grandmother taught me when facing difficult situations. "Everything's fine, Pete. It's just time to make some changes." He nodded slowly, recognizing something in my tone that said this wasn't a conversation. It was a decision already made. Within an hour, Pete's truck was in my driveway, and we were walking through my house together, him making notes about door sizes and lock types, while I pointed out every entrance that needed securing. Front door, back door, side door leading to the garden, even the basement entrance that I rarely used but that Sarah had a key to from years ago. As we worked, I felt something shifting inside me, a sense of power returning that I hadn't realized I'd lost until this moment when I was actively reclaiming it. By noon, the work was finished, and I stood in my living room holding a ring of shiny new keys that caught the afternoon light streaming through my windows. Each key represented a choice, a boundary, a declaration that this house belonged to Dorothy May Henderson, and no one else. Pete had been quietly efficient, understanding somehow that this was about more than simple home security, and when he handed me the final key, he squeezed my hand gently and said, "You call if you need anything else, you hear?" I spent the afternoon on my front porch, rocking in the swing Robert had hung for me, when arthritis made standing in the garden too painful for long stretches. The November air was crisp, but not cold, and I sat there with my new keys in my lap, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, complete control over my own space, my own life, my own dignity. As the sun began to set behind the maple trees, lining my street, I heard a car approaching, and knew without looking that my new life was about to begin in earnest. Sarah's white SUV pulled into my driveway at exactly 5:30, right on schedule for what had become her Thursday evening ritual of stopping by to check on Mom, though I'd begun to suspect these visits were more about raiding my refrigerator than genuine concern for my well-being. I watched from my porch swing as she gathered her purse and phone, moving with that brisk efficiency that always made me feel like I was just another item on her endless to-do list. She walked up my front steps with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her welcome, key already in her hand before she reached the door. The sound of her key scraping against the new lock was music to my ears, followed by the confused silence as she tried again, then again, the metal grinding against metal in a symphony of frustration that made my heart sing with satisfaction. "What the hell?" I heard her mutter, a word she'd never have used in my presence as a child, and I had to press my lips together to keep from smiling. She rang the doorbell then, pressing it with that impatient rhythm I recognized from years of listening to her, summon me like a servant in my own home. I remained exactly where I was, rocking gently in my swing, watching her through the window as she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. My landline started ringing inside the house, that old-fashioned bell tone that Robert had always said sounded like home. But I made no move to answer it. Let it ring, let her wonder, let her feel, for just a moment, what it was like to be shut out, to be made to feel unwelcome in a place where she'd always assumed her presence was desired. Sarah tried the doorbell again, then knocked with increasing urgency, her voice rising as she called, "Mom? Mom, are you okay? What's wrong with your door?" I could hear the edge of panic creeping in, and part of me, the mother part that had spent decades soothing her fears, wanted to rush to the door and explain. But the larger part, the part that still stung from being called worthless, stayed firmly planted in my swing, watching this woman who looked like my daughter but acted like a stranger learn what it felt like to be locked out. When she finally cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted loud enough for the neighbors to hear, "Mom, why did you change the locks?" I felt a surge of something I hadn't experienced in years, pure, unadulterated power. Not the petty kind that comes from hurting others, but the deep, satisfying kind that comes from finally standing up for yourself after too many years of being taken for granted. I could see Mrs. Peterson next door peeking through her curtains, and I waved at her cheerfully, as if there was nothing unusual about my daughter having a meltdown on my front porch. Eventually, Sarah gave up and stalked back to her car, her movements sharp with frustration, and what might have been the first glimmer of understanding that something fundamental had changed between us. As she pulled out of my driveway, tires spinning on the gravel, I continued rocking in my swing, my new keys warm in my palm, feeling more like myself than I had in years. The first battle in the war for my dignity had been won, and I was just getting started. Saturday morning brought David and the twins to my door, and watching them through my living room window, I felt my resolve waver for the first time since I'd made my decision. The boys had their bicycles, planning one of their usual rides around my neighborhood before lunch, and they kept looking toward my house with confusion written across their 8-year-old faces. David stood at my front door looking uncomfortable, running his hand through his hair the way he always did when faced with family drama. He didn't understand or want to navigate. "Dorothy," he called, his voice carrying that careful tone people use when they think they're dealing with someone who might not be quite right in the head. "The kids wanted to see their grandma. Is everything okay?" I watched from behind my lace curtains as one of the twins, I could never tell them apart from a distance, sat down on my front steps and started picking at the loose threads on his sneakers. That particular brand of childhood disappointment that hit straight to the heart of any grandmother worth her salt. The rational part of my mind whispered that I should open the door, that these innocent children had done nothing wrong, that punishing them for their mother's cruelty was beneath the woman I'd always tried to be. But the stronger part, the part that had finally learned to protect itself, knew that if I opened this door now, if I let family guilt override my newfound boundaries, everything would go right back to the way it was. Sarah would dismiss this as one of Grandma's episodes, and by next Thanksgiving I'd be called worthless again. David tried knocking, then pressing the doorbell, and finally calling my name with increasing desperation. "Please, Dorothy, if something's wrong, let us help. Sarah's worried about you." At that, I almost laughed out loud. Sarah was worried about me now. Where was that worry when she was cutting me down at my own dinner table? I stayed in my chair, my hands folded in my lap, watching my grandsons grow more confused and disappointed with each passing minute. When they finally left, the twins trailing behind their father, with slumped shoulders and backward glances at my house, I felt the first real crack in my armor. Sitting alone in my living room, surrounded by photographs of those same little boys at Christmas mornings and birthday parties, I wondered if I was being too harsh, if maybe there was another way to handle this situation that wouldn't involve innocent children feeling abandoned by the grandmother who had promised to always be there for them. But then I remembered Sarah's laugh when she called me worthless, the casual cruelty in her voice, the way she'd dismissed decades of love and sacrifice with a few thoughtless words. My grandsons would understand someday, when they were older, when they had their own parents treating them like inconveniences. Sometimes the people we love most need to learn that love isn't a license to treat us badly, and sometimes that lesson comes at a cost that breaks everyone's heart, including our own. That evening I sat in my bedroom with the old shoebox of memories I kept on the closet shelf, sorting through decades of Mother's Day cards, school photos, and little notes that had once meant the world to me. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was a crayon drawing Sarah had made in 2nd grade, our house with stick figures of our family standing in front, and the words, "My mommy is the best mommy in the world," written in purple crayon across the bottom. I held that paper like a prayer, remembering the little girl who had thought I hung the moon, and wondering how she'd grown into a woman who could look at me and see only worthlessness. Sunday morning found me in church for the first time in months, sitting in the back pew where I used to sit with Robert when the children were small, and we needed a quick escape route if someone got fussy. Pastor Williams was delivering a sermon about honoring our parents, and the irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a mother who felt dishonored by her own child, seeking comfort in words about respect that my daughter had never heard or had chosen to forget. The familiar hymns washed over me like a balm, voices raised in harmony the way families should be, but mine no longer was. After the service, I stood in the churchyard accepting condolences and concern from neighbors who'd heard whispers about my locked doors and missing daughter. Margaret Foster, who'd taught Sunday school with me for 15 years, took my hands in hers and said, "Honey, whatever's happening, you don't have to face it alone. We're here for you." Her kindness almost undid me. This reminder that I was valued by people who weren't obligated by blood to love me, who chose to see worth in an old woman, even if her own family couldn't. I drove home through streets lined with oak trees dropping their last golden leaves, past houses where other families were probably gathering for Sunday dinner, and I felt the weight of my decisions settling around me like a heavy coat. My house stood empty and quiet, the afternoon light slanting through windows that had once looked out on children playing in the yard, and for the first time since I'd changed those locks, I wondered if I'd cut off my nose to spite my face, as my mother used to say. The phone rang as I was heating soup for one, and Sarah's number flashed on the caller ID like an accusation. I let it ring 5 times before I picked up, and her voice was different when I said hello, smaller somehow, less certain. "Mom," she said, and there was something in that single word that made my heart skip. "We need to talk. Can I come over? I looked around my kitchen, at the single bowl on the counter, at the quiet that had become both my sanctuary and my prison, and I almost said yes. But then I remembered Thanksgiving, remembered the laughter in her voice when she'd called me worthless, and I found my strength again. We can talk, I said carefully, but not at my house, not until you remember how to treat the woman who gave you life with the respect she deserves. The silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to wonder if she'd hung up, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with something that might have been tears. Mom, I said something terrible. I know I did. Please let me make it right. Some things can't be unmade. Sarah, I told her, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. But they can be forgiven if the person who did them understands why forgiveness is needed. I heard her take a shaky breath, and when she spoke again, she sounded like the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. I do understand, Mom. I understand. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The conversation that followed was the first real one we'd had in years. The kind where walls come down and truth gets told, even when it hurts. By the time we hung up, we'd agreed to meet the next day at Murphy's Diner, neutral ground, where we could try to rebuild what had been broken. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness yet. That would take time. But the possibility of it, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through winter-hard ground. What happened at Murphy's Diner the next day changed everything between Sarah and me, but not in the way I'd expected. She arrived looking smaller somehow, her usual polished confidence replaced by something raw and vulnerable that reminded me of the uncertain teenager she'd once been. We sat in the same booth where I'd worked as a girl, and she cried real tears as she told me about the stress in her marriage, the pressure she felt to be perfect, the way she'd been taking her frustrations out on the person she knew would always love her no matter what. I called you worthless because I was feeling worthless myself, she whispered, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like it was an anchor. But that doesn't excuse it, Mom. Nothing excuses treating you that way. She looked up at me with Robert's eyes, and I saw my daughter again. Not the stranger who'd hurt me, but the child I'd raised to be better than this. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, she continued, but I want to earn it back. I want to remember how to be your daughter again. The road back wasn't easy or quick. Sarah had to learn to knock instead of walking into my house uninvited. Had to remember to ask instead of assume. Had to rebuild trust that had been shattered by careless words. But slowly, Sunday by Sunday, meal by meal, conversation by conversation, we found our way back to each other. She brought the twins over for supervised visits, teaching them to treat their grandmother with the respect she deserved. And I watched them relearn that love and boundaries could coexist. I never gave Sarah a key to those new locks, and she never asked for one. Instead, she learned to call first, to wait for permission, to treat my home like the sacred space it had always been, but that she'd forgotten to honor. The house that had once been filled with people who took me for granted became a place where visitors understood that being welcomed was a gift, not a right, and that gift should be treasured accordingly. Before I close this story, I want to thank you for listening to my experience here on Letters to Helen. If this reminded you of your own struggles with family respect, please subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me what local you're listening from. Every day brings a new story, and perhaps one of them will speak to your heart the way I hope mine has spoken to yours today. 6 months after that awful Thanksgiving, Sarah surprised me by bringing a pumpkin pie she'd made from scratch, using my grandmother's recipe, the one I'd tried to teach her years ago, when she was too impatient to learn. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where she'd called me worthless, and she said the words every mother dreams of hearing. Mom, I forgot who I was talking to. I forgot that you're not just my mother. You're Dorothy Mae Henderson, and you've always been worth more than I knew how to see. We still have our difficult moments, my daughter and I, because changing a lifetime of patterns doesn't happen overnight. But now when she comes to visit, She knocks on my door like a guest who values her invitation. Now she asks instead of assumes, listens instead of dismisses, remembers that the woman who raised her is still a person with feelings, dreams, and dignity that no one has the right to diminish. That's the difference between being old and being worthless, you see. Being old is simply what happens when you're blessed with enough time to accumulate wisdom, stories, and the kind of love that weathers every storm. Being worthless? Well, that's something nobody has the right to make you feel, no matter how much you've loved them, or how much you've sacrificed for their happiness. Sometimes the people who love us most need to be reminded that we're still here, still valuable, still deserving of respect. And sometimes, changing the locks on your doors is really about unlocking the dignity you never should have lost in the first place. My name is Dorothy Mae Henderson. I'm 72 years old, and I am worth every bit of love and respect I've finally learned to demand.